Thank you, Ed. And I was really pleased when Ed told me that this would be my job at the conference this year. I know Daryl made a lot of comments earlier about standing in the way between you and lunch and then going directly after you. I think Dr. Gottlieb and I have the most difficult job being the people standing between you and the bar. But I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our final speaker today, Dr. Scott Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb isn't a stranger to many of us in the room, but for those of you who don't live and breathe regulatory and reimbursement policy, he's a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He returned there earlier this year after serving as the 23rd Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. During his time as FDA Commissioner, he fostered a reputation as a dedicated reformer with a record number of novel and generic approved drugs under his belt. There were 56 new indications approved for currently marketed agents, 35 new molecular entities approved, and biosimilars for the active treatment of cancer that came to market during this time. A landmark achievement during his time as commissioner was the introduction of the first commercial CAR T-cell therapy, and we heard a lot about that this morning. Newly approved agents for rare diseases and several pediatric cancers. It was truly an impressive period of growth, but particularly notable for personalized medicine. FDA blazed some new frontiers under his leadership in the personalized medicine space. We saw the first approvals of tissue agnostic therapies, as well as a number of regulatory precedents on the diagnostic side to accelerate commercial diagnostics to help guide treatments to the right patients. In addition to these and many other noteworthy achievements, I'm actually going to bring up another milestone that he had the unfortunate pleasure of overseeing. It was the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, and he had to shepherd one of the most important federal agencies during that time. And you won't find it in his bio. I actually tried to look for something that we didn't already include in the program to highlight. He may not really care to remember this, but I raise it because it highlights the quality of person he is and why he continues to be an important leader. He accepted this difficult moment with grace, and his actions during the time of the shutdown reminded me of a quote from one of the books that I love most, When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron. And at 5 o'clock, the last thing you want to be hearing is quotes from a Buddhist nun, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. And I'd like to share it with you. She writes, "We don't set out to save the world. We set up to wonder how people are doing and to reflect on how our actions affect other people's hearts." Dr. Gottlieb openly expressed the personal toll that this took on him and his team, but he never failed to dedicate himself to supporting the FDA staff through the 35-day shutdown and upon their return to work. FDA continued its mission to protect and promote public health during the shutdown, and it's something that we should never forget and we should be continually thankful for. In March of 2019, Dr. Gottlieb announced that he'd be leaving his post after just under 2 years at the helm. The announcement came as a surprise and, frankly, I know a great disappointment to many of you in the community. But at AEI, he continues his work to improve public health through entrepreneurship and medical innovation, along with ideas to expand regulatory approaches that maintain patient and physician autonomy. Whether he consciously set out to save the world or not, Dr. Gottlieb continues to leave a positive mark on it and is a leading voice on policies we desperately need now to preserve incentives for research and innovation while still making care affordable for patients and for our healthcare system. We're really fortunate that he can be here with us this afternoon, and we all look forward to hearing his thoughts on what the policy landscape looks for personalized medicine. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me here today. It's a real honor to be with this group. This has been a great group to work with when I was at the agency. I knew we were entering an era of personalized medicine when I had to send out a public health advisory warning people not to CRISPR themselves while I was FDA commissioner. I remember last time I was at FDA, I had to send out a public health advisory warning people not to use decorative contact lenses during Halloween, so times have really changed. I actually, on that approval of the first CAR T, so it was Kymriah, obviously. It was about my 3rd month on the job. I've told this story before, so some of you might have heard it. I was briefing the president. I was in the Oval Office briefing him on drug pricing, and at the end of the briefing, they wanted me to tell him about the first gene therapy approval that we were going to do on the president's watch. It was about 2 weeks before the approval. So I briefed the president about it, and he was very enthused about it. And he always liked the stories about the technology that was being advanced on our watch over this time period, and was very optimistic about about the life science technology that we were seeing come to market. And he was so excited about it. As I was walking out of the Oval Office, I had a pang of anxiety, worry that he was going to tweet about it. So I was in a meeting with Jared Kushner, and I had to ask his son-in-law to go back in and tell him he couldn't tweet about it because it was still commercial confidential. And I stood outside the Oval Office just making sure this interaction happened. I didn't know which was worse at this point, him tweeting about it 2 weeks before the approval, or me admonishing the president that he couldn't tweet about it. So I stood there and watched, and I saw the president go, "I know." So I felt really good after seeing that. But that was my introduction to briefing him and the Cambria approval. I thought I would talk about. I just want to talk briefly because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. Some of the things that we were thinking about on how to advance personalized medicine, and I want to talk across three different domains and just give some examples of the kinds of things that we tried to advance. First, thinking about how to create incentives and directional change in innovation in clinical trials to allow more personalized kinds of approaches to care to come to market. How to drive innovation, the kinds of data that's being collected that could be used to advance more personalized care, and then innovation in tools that can help inform more personalized delivery. On the clinical trial front, we recognized that a lot of the drugs that were being put into development were targeted towards genotypic features of disease and no longer the phenotypic features of disease. And the question was how to help those advances. And that's when you saw us try to advance paradigms like basket trials or tissue agnostic approvals, where we wanted to open up avenues for drug developers to put drugs into development that targeted the molecular features of disease and not just the phenotype. And this was most evident in oncology, where we made the first tissue agnostic approvals, and we put forward a framework for doing basket trials, where what we said was if you had a cancer drug that targeted some common molecular feature of cancer, instead of studying that cancer as lung cancer or pancreatic cancer or liver cancer, where the same molecular features drove the creation of tumors in different organ systems, we would allow studies on the basis of the ability to target the molecular feature, and you can enroll all the different kinds of tumor types in the context of the same clinical trial and get an approval across all the different tumor types across all different organ systems. And this was a way to enable sponsors with drugs targeted to rare mutations to get sufficient numbers of patients enrolled in a clinical trial to be able to show a statistically valid effect on a tumor and get basically a pan approval. A new way of thinking about how to do clinical development, and a paradigm that we're now seeing get adopted in other clinical contexts. This isn't just specific to oncology, but we're seeing people try to adopt the same approaches in other contexts. We advanced the concept of N of 1 trials, the idea that if you have a common backbone where you were just changing either a gene cassette or some molecular component of the drug, like an oligo, and you were just changing the gene sequence that it was targeting, could you extrapolate across the preclinical data that you had developed around the backbone and not have to replicate a whole preclinical tox package, but basically figure out a pathway where you could allow the approval of the drug almost as a service, where you were just tweaking it on an individualized basis for patients. And in fact, the FDA, the agency, is working on a guidance document to enable such a approach. And I had taken very few meetings. Actually, one of my regrets in the job was that I was so insular and took so few meetings. We were so concerned about the perception of showing favoritism to sponsors or individuals that we were very careful about the kinds of meetings that I scheduled on my calendar. But one of the very few meetings I took with a patient representative was with Timothy Wu, and the mom of the girl, Mila, that was profiled in the New York Times, because it was such a compelling illustration of the ability to try to advance this sort of N of 1 framework. And Janet Woodcock and others in CETA had a very very strong desire to try to advance that kind of framework. And the other place we tried to create an approach that allowed more personalized care was our approach to, in my view, our approach to cell-based regenerative medicine, where when we came in, we recognized that there was a lot of what we felt was dangerous activity in the market. FDA had exercised enforcement discretion for a long period of time. The market had grown up to stem cell-based therapies, some of which were being used, in my view, in untoward ways without a lot of clinical evidence. So we felt we needed to start stepping in and take more aggressive enforcement action. At the same time, we wanted to open up a framework to allow investigators who were doing cell-based therapies on an individualized basis to have a route to the market, to have a way to come in and get FDA approval. And so at the same time that we stepped up our enforcement activity, in fact, the one place where I had sent federal marshals in to seize a product was in the context of a cell-based regenerative medicine. We took some pretty aggressive enforcement actions and went to federal court to sustain that action. At the same time that we did that, we advanced a guidance document that created a brand new framework where what we said was, if you're an individual academic investigator, and a lot of the people who are advancing cell-based therapies were individual investigators in institutions who couldn't possibly have the capacity or the resources to file a BLA with CBER, file a biologics license application. But what we said was, as long as you're following a common manufacturing protocol, we're going to allow different researchers to pool their data and file a common biologics license application, basically develop a consortia to file a license application, and we'll give individual site licenses to each individual investigator. So you as an investigator can literally hold a BLA as long as you're following common manufacturing protocol, even if you're using the stem cell therapies in slightly different ways. And this was a way to allow small investigators to pool together, even if they were trying to do things that were really personalized for patients in their individual institutions. And in fact, this framework, I think, can be used in other contexts, including the context of the N of 1 studies. So once you sort of develop a novel framework for regulation, it's something that can get adopted more broadly. And we did that in this case, and I think we're going to see this become a more common framework in other contexts. In fact, by the time I left the agency, we didn't know if this was going to work. We didn't know if people would actually come in and take us up on it. And by the time I left the agency, which wasn't that long ago, there were 3 or 4 different consortia that had formed for purposes of trying to pool their data to come in and get approval for stem cell approaches that they were doing within their own academic institutions. So it was working. We had people taking us up on the offer of this new approach. I talked about innovation in data as well and things we tried to do to advance that. And here there was a lot of effort to try to advance the use of practical clinical data and real-world evidence in clinical development. I think we're at a real inflection point in the agency's embrace of these kinds of constructs, and I think that the inflection point is going to be driven by the resources that we got for the agency to try to stand up a consolidated, basically a data set to do near real-time safety surveillance in the post-market using real-world evidence. If you think back to after some of the drug safety scrutiny more than a decade ago following Vioxx, Congress passed legislation that gave the agency resources to stand up what came to be known as a Sentinel network, which was basically a consolidated data network, really, for the agency to access payer claims data as a way to do post-market drug safety surveillance. And that's become a very important tool for the agency. What we went out and did was we got $50 million added to the base of the agency's budget, which is actually a substantial amount of money for FDA in terms of a plus-up, to build out a consolidated database of electronic health record information. And we talked about consolidating 10 million lives of data. We're actually going to, the FDA is probably going to consolidate a lot more than that, to build out a consolidated database that the agency would use for post-market safety surveillance, near real-time post-market safety surveillance, and efficacy surveillance. And this was sort of a charge from Congress that came along with the money. I think this is going to supplant Sentinel in time, and why it's important and why I think it's going to create an inflection point at the agency is that now the agency has a mandate and has the resources to start developing methodologies for using real-world evidence to make its own drug safety and drug efficacy conclusions and insights. And so when you as sponsors, for the sponsors in the room, come in with real-world evidence that you want to use in the context of a registration trial or some kind of labeling negotiation, you're going to be interacting with an agency that is on its own working to validate these same methodologies. I think the whole sort of field of how to use real-world evidence to answer important regulatory questions is going to grow up very quickly. You know, if you compare this to sort of modeling and simulation, it took the agency about 15 years from the sort of idea of using modeling and simulation as a component of drug review to really institutionalizing that in drug review. I remember when we created the office, the modeling and simulation office back in 2003 or 2004, basically the office consisted of Larry Lesko. Some of you will know Larry Lesko is one person. Now the office is 35 people, and I would say well more than 95% of all applications that get filed with the agency have significant components of modeling and simulation built in. The sort of migration of using real-world evidence in clinical development is happening much more quickly than that, and so I think that the adoption curve is going to be fast there. The other thing that we tried to do and we were working on was working on ways to standardize reviews, developing standard templates for drug review. I think this too is going to make the agency's ability to adopt different data constructs much more efficient. And what a standardized review, the idea of a standardized review is that instead of being an agency that collects applications from sponsors, what we wanted to do is have a standard template where what we would get from sponsors is raw data, information, and that information would get dropped into this standardized template so that there'd be a consistent presentation of data as you went from review to review and division to division. So we would basically be moving the drug application process into a cloud-based environment. There would be a standardized application that reviewers would collaborate around, and instead of taking submissions from companies, we would take data from companies in a cloud-based way. I've just probably described Lotus Notes to all of you, and you're all sitting here, and you're like, we've been doing this for a long time. FDA hasn't. And you know, one of the insights, and Janet was driving this vision, but one of the insights was I would have lunch with people who worked in the division or the O directors. One day I had lunch with a medical reviewer who told me that she had spent her whole day reformatting data that had come in the application into a presentation that she liked to look at data in terms of the charts that she liked to review the data. And so here was a medical reviewer with a medical degree doing the work that probably a data analyst could do much more efficiently and more effectively. Wasn't a good use of her time. We were better off having expert data analysts doing that work of standardizing the format and the presentation of information, having the medical reviewers do the work of applying judgment and interpreting that information. And so that's the O&D reform and the structural changes we were making in the review process were aimed at doing that, creating a much more structured approach, having experts in data analytics do the analytical work and the reformatting of data and the presentation of information, and having the people who had expert clinical judgment, applying that judgment and making informed decisions about it. Finally, I said I wanted to talk about innovation on the delivery side and what places, where were there opportunities to innovate in the tools we had available to try to make more personalized delivery of care. And the two of the places that we really saw a lot of opportunity was one on the digital health side and two on the diagnostics. And on the diagnostics, you know, when I came to FDA, the sort of a typical approach of the agency, and this isn't a pejorative statement at all, when you have a new field of technology, you want to try to fit your existing statute and your existing regulation onto that technology. And the reason why you want to do that when you're at the FDA is, number one, the rulemaking process takes a very long time. So if you have to promulgate new regs to try to regulate a new field of technology, you know from soup to nuts, the average rule takes 2.5 years, and a complicated one could take 3 or 4 years. And if you have to go to Congress and seek new statute, you don't know what you're going to get. So you're sometimes reluctant as a regulator to open up that discussion. On the area of laboratory-developed tests and diagnostics, the agency had struggled for a very long period of time trying to fit the medical device paradigm to diagnostic tests. And what I said when I came in was that I would, in earnest, work to get a legislative solution. But we would agree that we weren't going to try to regulate laboratory-developed tests using guidance and trying to fit the medical device paradigm to laboratory-developed tests in places where we didn't think of fit, outside of a certain subset of cases where we had very acute public health concerns and we needed to take regulatory action to protect consumers and protect patients. And in fact, we went down that path. We worked closely with Congress. We passed back to Congress 70 pages of technical assistance to support the development of that IVCT legislation, which became the VALID Act and has been introduced on a bipartisan basis, which I think is going to pass. When I say 70 pages of technical assistance, people from Washington should probably smirk because 70 pages of technical assistance sounds awfully like a draft bill. We worked very closely on that to get that bill right and try to get a framework in place that was uniquely adapted to laboratory-developed tests. And in fact, we took it out of the traditional medical device paradigm and created a new paradigm that we called in vitro clinical tests that borrowed from the medical device paradigm but didn't treat laboratory-developed tests and diagnostic tests more generally as medical devices per se, but we created a separate framework. On digital health, you know, we really, I think one of the things that surprised me a little bit was the pace at which we saw those tools coming to market. I thought that there'd be much more rapid adoption of digital health tools in the context of delivering drugs as sort of drug service delivery systems. And I thought pharma would be making more rapid investments in digital health tools and promulgating them alongside drugs. One of the things that we did to try to facilitate that was we moved the regulation of a lot of digital health tools that were promulgated in the context of drug approvals to the promotional labeling rather than the product labeling. And by doing that, we subjected them to post-market enforcement, basically post-market regulation. Because if the digital health tool was part of the drug label, it would have been subject to pre-market approval requirements. By putting the digital health tool into the promotional labeling of the drug product, it was subject to post-market regulation. And depending on the claims you're making, I mean, if you're making treatment claims with a digital health tool, you're going to be regulated as a medical product. But there's plenty of green pastures and area for people to promulgate digital health tools that can help with compliance, help collect information, help inform patients about the drugs they're taking, and allow them to be more active participants in their care, where you're not making outcomes claims, and you can promulgate that digital health tool alongside a drug and probably, I think, affect a better goal for the patient. So I think that represents an area of a lot of opportunity. My belief is that companies are going to realize, over time, how to make wider use of digital health tools as a way to develop a better relationship with both the providers and the patients in an environment right now where it's very hard for drug companies to have a relationship with providers and patients because it's so tightly regulated. A lot of the traditional avenues for communication are closed off, including promotional avenues. So those were some of the opportunities we saw. I think looking out on the landscape, I think some of the biggest challenges we face are on the coverage side and just making sure that these opportunities are accessible to patients. I was in Washington today and did a luncheon for some members of Congress, and the sense of concern around the challenges with access and the perception that pricing is playing a prominent role in foreclosing access for a lot of patients who need these therapeutics is really palpable. And the mood, I think, has changed a lot on Capitol Hill. And so the environment's ripe for something to get done, probably not before the next election in my view, but something will get done. And I think we're at a sort of, not a perilous point, but a fragile period of time right now where if we don't make the right decisions of what we do in policy to try to make sure more people have access to these opportunities, and these opportunities are democratized, and your ability to access a curative treatment or a gene therapy isn't dependent on what insurance pool you're born into. If we don't make the right decisions about how we enable those opportunities, some of these opportunities can be foreclosed, because what's going to get lost if we make the wrong decisions in policy, I'll just close here, isn't necessarily we'll have 5 to 18 fewer or 8 to 15 fewer drugs, as the CBO said in response to the Speaker's bill. I think what's going to get lost is the risk-taking. If we raise the cost of capital in this sector and we start regulating the returns, you're not going to see companies get out of developing drugs. You'll see companies start to take less risk and start to make different kinds of bets, and the nature of the innovation that takes place could change. You still might get the same number of drugs, but you'll get different drugs. And in a time when we all believe, I think, that the life science field is really the opportunity of the century that we're in to really transform human health, it would be a shame to see a lot of the really big bets that we've been making on science in recent years when it comes to gene editing, gene therapy, cell-based regenerative medicine, and all the things that we probably can't even envision right now get foreclosed because we've made policy decisions that sap some of the risk-taking that has enabled these opportunities to come forward. So with that, I left 25 minutes for questions. I'm looking forward to it. I know this is a very good group, so thanks for having me here today.
Hi, Scott. It's Natasha Loder here from The Economist. Talking about drug pricing and less risk, I mean, one of the lessons I'm hearing from the biotech companies I'm talking to is that there is less risk, and the drugs that they're creating are targeted. They know the molecular target, they know the population, the patients, they can select them. They're talking about drugs that can be developed in 5 years, not 10 years. They're talking about 400 million per drug, not 1 to 2 billion. So perhaps actually there is less risk that's being taken, and perhaps the model that the pharmaceutical firms have been telling us actually isn't the one that's actually on the ground if you go and talk to biotech companies around here. So maybe actually what we do need is more pressure on pricing, because that will favour more personalised drugs. And so that's up for discussion.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to get more pressure on pricing, so I think that's an inevitability. I think the risk that I see, the risk-taking that I see is on the very novel platforms. I think when you're talking about, using novel systems for gene editing or very novel approaches to regenerative medicine, those are unproven platforms, and so that takes a high degree of capital investment and a high degree of uncertainty. And when you're sitting here looking at these programs, and from a venture capital standpoint, and I obviously work with a venture capital firm now, and you're risk adjusting these models, and many of you in this room do the same thing. You're going to risk adjust a very novel platform where it's unproven, the regulatory pathway is unproven, differently than you would risk adjust a small molecule targeting, biology that's well understood. And so that's where you see a change in the risk-taking behavior. If your cost of capital goes up, and your cost of capital would go up under some of these policy constructs, and your returns get capped, and your returns would get capped under some of these policy constructs, in order to get over the hurdle rate, you're going to have to adjust your model in some way. And the one place that you can adjust the model in that scenario is to try to lower your risk. So you're going to look for ways to de-risk the development program or look for less risky things to invest in. I think that's the risk of some of these constructs. And look, we might be willing to make that trade-off. When we designed, and I was around when we did it, when we designed Part D, part of the reason why we reinsured all the specialty drug spend in Part D, the biggest reason we did is because we wanted to make sure premiums were low at the time of launch of those Part D plans. So we felt by reinsuring the specialty drugs and taking it off of the plans, premiums would come in lower, and in fact they did that. But part of the thinking was that by reinsuring the category of specialty drugs, we would shift incentives towards the development of specialty drugs. This was over a time period when the common refrain was everyone's developing Me Too products, everyone wants the 10th statins, nobody's innovating. Drug companies are investing in, OTC drugs and animal health and generics, and they're not investing their capital in high-risk endeavors that could potentially cure disease. And so we tried to design a structure in Part D that would drive investment towards higher risk specialty drugs. I'm not saying that's the only reason that the complexion of the industry has changed, but I think it's one of the reasons. We made deliberate policy decisions to try to drive investment towards unmet medical needs and make it very competitive if you were if you were in a market where there was good enough generics. That was going to be hard to compete in. So you saw companies get out of primary care indications and go towards specialty indications in, basically in an overwhelming way. So if we want to make policy decisions that drive investment back towards different kinds of development, we can do that. We should have a strong public health rationale for why we're doing it, and we should understand that we're doing it.
Hi, Scott. I'm Nina Hill with Pfizer. I hope it's okay to ask this question. And thank you for all that you did to help us address unmet needs. We understand that 21st Century Cures 2.0 may be afoot, and that representatives are doing a listening tour. What would you like to see if there's such a vehicle in order to advance both precision medicine and digital health and other innovations?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think if we try to do something, we had a meeting this morning actually with Mark McClellan at the Duke Margolis Center talking about how to create different kinds of efficiencies in the coverage process with CMS, so that when you had new innovation, very novel innovation, there was a more predictable process for coverage under Medicare. And I think that if we do a sort of Cures 2.0, we ought to think about how to innovate and create more predictability in the coverage process as well. One of the things that I've observed is that a lot of the sort of definitions that Congress has attached around some of these pathways that is created in the regulatory process, whether it's things targeted to the development of anti-infectives for multi-drug resistant organisms, or even the breakthrough pathway, the language that Congress uses to describe why it's trying to create incentives in the development process to make the regulatory process more efficient go beyond just safety and efficacy. There is an expression of of value delivered to consumers. And so to the extent that the language is starting to more closely resemble the kind of legal threshold and determination that CMS has to make to make sure something's reasonable and necessary for the Medicare population, I think that there's places where you could say that if FDA gives makes a certain determination that a product is eligible for a certain expedited pathway, that meets the regulatory burden for being reasonable and necessary, and it could be a presumption of coverage. And so I think that you can get more alignment between the regulatory and the coverage process that way. CMS will balk because they'll say that it takes away some of their discretion, but you don't have to say CMS has to cover it a certain way. You just just say there has to be some base level of coverage, maybe with coverage with evidence development, and by doing that for both medical devices and maybe certain categories of drugs, by creating a presumption of coverage, you lower the cost of capital. That becomes a ticket that makes it easier to raise capital for the development of that product because there's going to be some base level of coverage. So I think thinking about how to do that in a sort of Cures 2.0 and thinking beyond just a regulatory process. The other thing I would say is that we've made a lot of accommodations in the regulatory process to get breakthrough drugs or drugs that we think are transformative to the market more efficiently. And what we're seeing is that in a lot of these categories of drugs targeted to unmet medical needs, the second to market innovation isn't coming to market anymore. Part of that, I think, is a function of that when you have a drug that's targeting a small population, being second to market is sometimes very hard. You can't sustain second to market innovation in a small population where the prevalence population has already been treated, and you're just going to split the incidence population. The incidence population, the number of people diagnosed with a disease each year, might not be enough to sustain second-to-market innovation. The other challenge is that it's hard to enroll the registration trials if it's a truly unmet medical need and there's first-to-market innovation. It's going to be hard to find people to enroll in a study, especially if you want to do a placebo-controlled trial. Nobody's going to enroll in that. You're going to have to look to do it ex-US. That might not be ethical. And so I think we need to think about how to create incentives in these categories where you're targeting unmet medical needs, not just for first-to-market innovation, but also second-to-market innovation. One, it creates competition that facilitates access, and two, the therapeutic differentiation is important. If it's truly an area of significant unmet medical need, some people aren't going to respond to one molecule, they might respond to another. You want some therapeutic differentiation. We actually studied this systematically. And it's very apparent that the time it takes to get second-to-market innovation to the market has been extended, and more of these categories remain monopolies in perpetuity. We had the data. We studied it. We had the data. It was submitted to a journal. It should have been published. I don't know where it is. It should be coming out soon. I think they held on to it until I left, so I couldn't get my name on it.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much.
Hi, Scott. Daryl Pritchard with the Personalized Medicine Coalition. I really appreciate that you brought up the effect of the drug pricing push on innovation. And I was hoping you would make some comments about the potential for third-party value assessment frameworks to be used to sort of dictate pricing or to be used to influence payers, including CMS, on the pricing thing and how that can affect innovation.
Yeah, well, I think there's probably an inevitability to this in this country, and when you're having a discussion about importing OECD pricing into both Part B and Part D, I think that if that comes to pass, or some element of that comes to pass, I think a lot of people who are involved in these endeavors are going to say, you know what, I'd prefer a US-style HTA process that makes assessments based on our values and our systems, as opposed to just merely importing the results of European HTA processes, i.e. OECD pricing. So I think that is going to compel us to think more broadly about what we do here. Now, if we do end up with some kind of HTA framework in this country, I think it's going to be, uniquely American. It's probably not going to be one entity like you have in the UK, where you have NICE. It, hopefully would be multiple entities that might compete to try to do assessments, and you'd have to, price a product relative to one of them or some aggregation of them, and it'd have to be within a certain benchmark of what they're coming up with. Sort of similar to the way we've developed compendia processes in Medicare Part B to make determinations that coverage is tied to when it comes to oncology products in Part B, where we sort of outsource some of that to expert opinion that has to operate under certain rules and certain regulations. I think that that's probably what an HTA process would look like here in the U.S. But I do think we're probably a political cycle away from that kind of a reckoning, especially if you start seeing proposals go forward to tie pricing to OECD prices in either Medicare Part B, or there's some speculation they might try to do it in Medicare Part D. I don't know that these frameworks are going to be easy to implement. They might not be workable, but the fact that we're having this discussion and regulation seems to be going forward, it represents a real turning point, I think, in the mood in Washington and what's possible right now in this environment.
Ryan Cross from Chemical and Engineering News. I've been covering the N of 1 therapy movement, and so my question is, what happens when we have dozens or hundreds of groups trying to do these N of 1 therapies? What happens when we have biotech companies trying to do N of 1 therapies? And where do we draw the line between N of 1 versus N of a few or N of 10?
Well, I didn't know there's press in the room. I guess it's just not off the record. No, I'm kidding. It's an interesting question what the business model is here. I'm not sure that there's an easy business model, because if you think about what people are doing right now with the oligos, it's not very novel technology, and so it's not clear that you're going to be able to protect the underlying technology. You probably can't protect the process. And it's exceedingly expensive. I mean, the cost of goods, especially if you have to do a full preclinical tox package, which I don't think you'd have to do in time, but even a little bit of toxicology, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars for cost of goods related to just a single N of 1 therapy right now, even with a well-established framework like an oligo, if you look at what Timothy Wu's doing and some of the others. So I'm not sure what the business model is here, whether or not this is something that can be done in a for-profit way, or whether or not it has to be done in sort of a charitable way with some foundation support, maybe by institutions, supported by philanthropy. And I also don't know that the market can sustain too many of these. I think there's going to be some consortiums probably that come together, some academic institutions that come together to try to create these kinds of frameworks. But I'm not sure the market's going to be flooded with dozens and dozens of different approaches here because of the challenges of doing this on a commercial scale. From a regulatory standpoint, if I had to look in a crystal ball and guess what's going to happen, I think what's likely to happen is that you have a backbone that's well understood, like an oligo, FDA, and you have sort of a suite of diseases, 60, 70 diseases, where you literally have a dozen patients with each disease, maybe even less than that. FDA requires you to study 3 different diseases, and once you can demonstrate clinical efficacy and safety or a favorable profile, then it allows you to extrapolate to diseases that have sort of similar characteristics in terms of not necessarily the phenotype, but the genotypic features of the disease itself, where the biology can create a presumption that if it works in one setting, it's likely to work in these other settings. And so after that, you can extrapolate to other adjacent disease entities. And it's somewhat similar to what the FDA has done in certain contexts where there's been diseases where there's slightly different genetic variants from patient to patient, but they've given approval across all the genetic variants for a drug that seems to target all the genetic variants, but they didn't require a study in each individual genetic variant. And sometimes the FDA has contemplated approvals for broad indications if you can study the underlying features of the indication in a couple of different settings. And so one example, it's a bad example, but it's an example, is modafinil, where Cephalon tried to seek an approval for modafinil as an alertness pill. Modafinil is sort of the go pill that pilots use to stay awake on like 30-hour bombing runs. And so the company studied it in 3 different settings where alertness was a feature. One was sleep shift work disorder, sleep work disorders, where you had shift work at night, where you were up at night, and then you had to sleep during the day. And there were 2 others. Ultimately, FDA didn't grant them the broad indication. They studied all 3, and they demonstrated efficacy. I think FDA didn't grant them the indication for a variety of reasons. I wasn't there at the time. I think one was concerned on the AdCom that it would become sort of a lifestyle pill. But that's an example of the regulatory construct of allowing sponsor to study something in multiple settings and then extrapolating beyond that. So I think that that's probably the construct that you end up coming to. Now, I'm not sure where the agency is. I didn't look in on the guidance before I left, so I don't know where the thinking was on this. This is just my speculation.
Hi, Jen Mahoney from Asuragen. I'm going to start my question with my belief, which is precision diagnostics is really critical for precision medicine. So in order to have robust and safe diagnostics, the IVD path is great. However, it does not enjoy the same protection as new drug approval, where FDA provides exclusivity. So, even if you go through the rigor of IVD approval, you are facing LDT in the field. So my question is, what do you think FDA can do to provide more protection to IVD manufacturers to encourage more risk-taking?
Well, I mean, FDA doesn't really confer exclusivity. There's certain places where FDA confers exclusivity. Most drugs are protected by different patents, use patents, and composition of matter patents. In places where FDA confers exclusivity, you get 3 to 5 years of Hatch-Waxman exclusivity for an NME. You can get orphan drug exclusivity. So there are places where Congress confers additional exclusivity and data protection when a drug, meets certain sort of public health imperatives. On the diagnostic side, I think the issue, in my view at least, isn't necessarily that you can't patent the underlying technology. The issue has been that you can innovate around the diagnostics very easily. And so even if you have exclusivity on something that you're doing that's unique, there's a lot of ability to innovate around any one person's technology. So that's been the bigger challenge. I'm not sure how you get around that. You can create a process where if a diagnostic is meeting some important public health consideration, maybe you confer some kind of data exclusivity, but I'm not sure that there's a real appetite in this environment for creating additional exclusivity for technology right now. Frankly, I think the momentum is in the other direction, trying to take away patents and exclusivity, not grant them. So that's a difficult discussion to be having right now.
Hi, Burns Blacksall, Christ Hospital Health Network in Cincinnati. And first of all, kudos for what you were able to accomplish in your time at the FDA. So I have a lot of questions. Some of them surround, like, should we be approving oncology drugs that prolong life for 1 to 2 weeks? But that's a separate discussion.
Happy to answer that one.
So, but my simple question is, the FDA recently released kind of tighter guidelines on pharmacogenomics. So there are tighter guidelines, but we do know that there is an impact to be had with doing pharmacogenomic profiling and prescribing. So how does the FDA or other agencies advocate for us to actually be covering those tests? Because we do know that there is an impact when they're utilized.
Yeah, well, so this was one of the places where I made the comment that we agreed that we weren't going to try to assert oversight over laboratory LDTs, tests that were being promulgated as LDTs, except for cases where we had, really clear public health concerns. And this was a case where we had clear public health concerns, and I was there for a good portion of this. We did everything we could. We initially put out a public health advisory relating our concerns. We communicated with sponsors. Finally, the agency issued a warning letter. So, that was driven by a view, among other things, that there was variable quality in terms of the pharmacogenomic tests that were being promulgated as LDTs, or there might have been variable quality. I won't make an assertion that there was. And people were making important clinical decisions about dosing drugs on the basis of tests that weren't being subject to a consistent standard for clinical validity. And so there was a public health concern here that was raised by some of the drug officials. And one of the things that I said when we made an agreement between all of us, and everyone was invested in this, and everyone felt good about what we were doing, that we would try to pursue legislation and hold off on trying to do things through guidance that could ultimately get in the way of legislation, because if there was a perception that we were able to partially address this problem through guidance, Congress is less likely to act. And so we wanted to get Congress to act. We wanted to have a framework, a proper framework created. But one of one of the agreements that we all had and all felt strongly about was that if we had a public health concern, we were going to take action in that area, and this was one of the places where we had a public health concern. So, one solution is to come in for FDA approval with a pharmacogenomic test. Another is going to be that I think a lot of these tests will have an easier path for validation once that regulatory framework's created, the IVCT framework, where FDA is going to grandfather in a lot of the tests and take a firm-based approach to the regulation of a lot of these tests and allow firms to go to market with tests and go to market with adaptations to their tests as long as they follow good SOPs. And so I think that there's a vision for how there can be a more efficient path to market for FDA-approved tests in this context.
Great, thank you.
Mark Adan from Illumina. We were really thrilled to see all of the innovation at the FDA and the parallel review process with the CMS. In your current role, when you think about the commercial payers in the US and risk adjusting your models, what advice do you have for them? Because we do not see the same progression as we have seen with CMS and FDA.
Same progression, because I would think that, you mean in terms of like a parallel review type of process? I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't see the same challenges with some of the commercial payers. I guess, there are situations where commercial payers are slow to adopt new technology or cover new technology, but the difference with the commercial payers and CMS, in my view at least, is, and we used to say this when we were at CMS isn't an ordinary payer. CMS makes binary decisions, and when they make a decision around a technology, it ends up driving the entire market. And so I think CMS needs to take a different sort of view around coverage than a commercial payer is free to do, because CMS ends up having such a disproportionate impact on whether or not the entire country is going to get access to a new technology. And that requires CMS, I think, to be more accommodative, more judicious, more flexible in how it approaches coverage, because CMS isn't setting the ceiling, it isn't setting the floor, it's setting the ceiling. Like there won't be coverage beyond what CMS determines, because everyone in the private market is going to follow CMS's coverage rules for the most part. And so that's why I think thinking about how CMS embraces new technology becomes very important, because it ends up having such a disproportionate impact on the market.
Thank you, Scott, especially for your candor. It's quite refreshing. I'm Steve Samet from the Wharton School, UPenn. We've heard a lot today about the internationalization of precision medicine, not only Europe, but China as well. Can you share with us any thoughts about the pace, direction, and possible conclusion of where we might go with international harmonization of regulation?
So I worked closely with the Europeans when I was there. We got in place frameworks for recognition of sort of joint regulatory principles, certainly on the manufacturing side, where we had mutual recognition of European oversight of manufacturing facilities, so we wouldn't be dually inspecting facilities. But you also saw the agency promulgate a number of joint documents around what the appropriate review standards would be for products, particularly in areas of unmet medical needs. So we put out that paper on the regulation of MPS diseases with EMA, where we sort of outlined what the clinical requirements would be for the pre-market review of drugs targeted to some of the MPS diseases that hadn't been drugged yet. And that was out of a recognition that with a lot of these rare diseases, there's a very small subset of patients globally, and if we're not all aligned on what the clinical trial should look like and don't allow an easy path towards the enrollment of a global clinical trial, you're not going to get innovation in some of these areas of extreme unmet medical need. I will say with my Chinese counterparts, and I met with them, it was a little bit more difficult because I think that the Chinese regulatory system was adopting a lot of policies that were non-tariff trade barriers. I think that there was a different approach being taken to what they were doing in their regulation, and so far as they were looking towards regulation, and maybe what the regulators weren't doing this, but the policymakers who were instructing the regulators were, but to the extent that there were aspects of what they were doing in their regulation that were designed to try to create barriers to entry for ex-Chinese technology or to protect incumbents in China, I'm not going to harmonize to that. And so, that made it a little bit more of a difficult discussion with the Chinese regulatory counterparts. Am I up on time? Last question? Oh, I'm out of time. Drinks. No, I'm sorry.
With the decreasing pricing and a dynamic range of next-generation sequencing, theoretically, I think we're going to start to see, probably in maybe less than a decade, the ability for a lab to maybe diagnose almost anything. Is the FDA prepared to use the full dynamic range of maybe next-generation sequencing in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. If you look at what we did with AI tools and next-generation sequencing, we tried to take a novel approach, I think, to how we regulate these products, recognizing the traditional regulatory paradigm didn't fit. And so what we said was, if you can demonstrate clinical validity against an external data set that's a validated data set, that would be sufficient for regulatory purposes. And we actually recognize the NIH data set as their genomic data set as a data set that can be used to validate next generation sequencing platforms, because we recognized we couldn't rip apart the platform itself, just like we couldn't rip apart an AI tool. We had to rely on the results that the tool was generating against a standardized data set and use that for regulatory purposes. I think one demonstration of this was when we approved the EKG app on the Apple Watch. Why that was very novel was everyone expected FDA to rip apart the watch and make sure that the watch was working. And what we said when we approved that was, we're going to ignore the watch and we're going to just look at the output of the software tool itself that sits on top of the watch. And as long as we can validate the results that it's generating, that would be sufficient for approving that. And so the same kind of concept we took with respect to the next generation sequencing platforms and AI medical devices as well. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the opportunity to be here tonight.
So we've come to the end of a long and productive day, and I invite you now to join us at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. There are buses waiting for us outside the front door that'll take us a very short distance to the museum. I hope you'll join us, so thank you.